mic button is on. Sorry, just some technical issues. Hello? Okay, I can hear myself. Great. Just is everyone's headphones working okay? Everyone can hear me? Amazing. Thanks, guys. So, welcome. I'm your moderator for today. My name's Rebecca Lariciano. I'm the advocacy advisor at TRIADE, an NGO that works on restoration in the Sahel. So it's a pleasure to be moderating this event. As you know, this event is on locally led adaptation for resilient food and agriculture, looking at co-design, collaboration, and capacity. So maybe just to open up this event, I want to sort of share a few key messages before we open to our panel. So, as we know, it's becoming more and more critical to address climate change and vulnerability at the local level where the impacts are most felt. Communities present the best place to foster innovation to address the challenges of climate change. Developing participatory measures through developed decision-making is going to be key to guaranteeing both ownership and sustainability of climate action. The Climate Resilience, Livestock and Climate Fragility, Conflict and Migration initiatives of the CGIAR, together with its various partners, are keen in sharing the different approaches and expertise they have gathered over the previous years in successfully delivering locally led and transformative adaptation. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce our first online speaker, Todd Crane, who's a principal scientist at the International Livestock Research Institute and will walk us through the principles of locally led climate action. So, Todd, are you online?
I am. Let me share my presentation and we'll be off.
Great, thank you.
As you said, the present scope of climate change impacts demands that we all bring all of our resources to bear in this urgent pursuit of effective, equitable, and timely adaptation to climate change that leverages local knowledge and institutional capacities, as well as public and private sector finances and research knowledge to address climate change. However, aligning the priorities and perspectives from global finance, programmatic, and technical spaces with local adaptive dynamics and complex realities remains a major challenge. Locally led adaptation has recently emerged as a promising framework for addressing this challenge. Endorsed by over 100 global, regional, national, and subnational organizations representing government, development, civil society, research, and financial sectors. The locally led adaptation framework outlines 8 key action principles designed to support greater synergies between climate finance, national and local institutional capacities, and effective climate action at local levels. I'm going to very briefly outline and frame this panel discussion with the 8 action principles of locally led adaptation. First is devolving decision-making to the lowest appropriate level. This is where adaptation actions are prioritized, designed, and implemented. We've often heard the maxim of that adaptation is inherently a local process, and this acknowledges that at the outset. The second key principle is addressing structural inequalities, and this is in relation to gender, age, disabilities, displacement and migration, indigeneity, etc. So we're really taking marginalization and structural inequalities very seriously and addressing them through locally led adaptation. The third principle is providing patient and predictable funding that can be accessed more easily. Fast-paced and impactful climate change adaptation often requires financial resources, but they need to be calibrated to local processes and local administrative processes and processes of socio-technical change. So funding needs to really take that seriously and work on meaningful time horizons with local processes. The fourth principle is investing in local capabilities to leave an institutional legacy. This really emphasizes that climate change adaptation simply isn't about a quick in and out few years to push an adoption of X or Y or Z technology, but it's about building local institutional capacities to continually and iteratively engage in climate change adaptation to generate solutions and to implement them in an iterative fashion that acknowledges the dynamics of climate change adaptation rather than being based on project-based donor funding cycles. The fifth principle of locally led adaptation is building a robust understanding of climate risk and uncertainty. While we acknowledge the local traditional indigenous capacities to anticipate climate risk and to deal with uncertainty, what people don't know can't help them. And so integrating improved knowledge of climate risk and climate dynamics as inputs from the scientific community is seen as a very valuable contribution to locally led adaptation. The sixth principle is based on flexible programming and learning. This needs to enable adaptive management in response to the inherent uncertainty of climate change and climate change impacts. And it needs to be learned from experience, learned from successes and from mistakes so that it can be flexible in the face of that uncertainty so that course changes are possible rather than, again, being locked into kind of programmatic, predetermined outcomes and pathways. The seventh principle is ensuring transparency and accountability to make sure that the locally led adaptation processes are responsive to local needs, again, rather than being uniquely responsive to donor priorities and donor processes, so that accountability to local impacts is paramount. And finally, it requires collaborative action and investment. This is between sectors, between donor agencies, between municipalities, between funding organizations so that they are mutually reinforcing and synergistic rather than duplicative or competing. So with this, I'd like to pass the floor over to our panelists who will elaborate their experiences and observations on locally led adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And indeed, this brings us to our first session on present-day challenges and the impact of locally led adaptation. So I'd like to welcome our panelist, Franz Schapendorf, who has been supporting the integration of climate security and peace and interventions and building awareness around this nexus, working with the CGIAR Focus Climate Security. I'd also then like to welcome our next panelist, Esther Omayo, who is joining us from online. Esther has been supporting livestock development work in rural Kenya, supporting pastoralists in adapting to climate change, working for the country government of Nandi in Kenya. So welcome, Esther. I hope you can hear us.
Yes, I'm present. Hi.
And then lastly, I'd like to welcome Alvaro Roja Ferreira, who has been engaged in research on locally led adaptation at UNU. Great, so we have everyone here. Welcome, panelists. So looking at the challenges and the impact of locally led adaptation, I'd like to address my first question to Esther. So, Esther, could you describe your experience implementing locally led adaptation and specifically how it has impacted the ways that producers, extensionists, private sector, and country governments pursue climate change adaptation? Esther?
Hi.
Hi, great.
Yes, you getting me? Yes, I'm Esther Omayo, and I'm an extensionist in livestock development. So I've been working with the dairy farmers in rural Nandi County, Kenya. So, and we have been working with using the pioneer positive deviance approach, whereby we are looking at how dairy farmers specifically are adapting towards climate change. So in this approach, we started by asking who is that farmer who is doing much better than the rest in that local context in the same environment, and that is what we call a positive deviant. And that one comes now to be our pioneer dairy farmer. So my experience has been that this process, the model, is really based on the participatory. We are all participating, the farmers, the other stakeholders in the dairy value chain. But what I can say is that according to me, it is a running process. In our research and extension, we are looking at what the farmers are doing. So, for example, our challenge in that count was inadequate livestock feed due to prolonged dry seasons and droughts, and the farmers are facing inadequate feed, which caused a reduction in their milk production. So, as the process of positive deviance approach implementation, we looked at which farmer is adapting they are using, so that they scale to the others through the knowledge networks. So the positive deviance has really deviated from the norm of conventional whereby we bring extension packages to the farmers. Here, the farmers, we are running together. The extension, the research, and the farmer is like we are co-testing those technologies and strategies which are helping these farmers to adapt towards climate change. So the model is so empowering that even farmers now can do research on their farms, what is working and what is not working. And then it is so collaborative that we are bringing together the local actors in the daily value chain, so that together we are looking at what here. For us, we are supported like from where I stand as an extensionist. My work now in this approach is supporting what those local strategies helping farmers to adapt. So this process has really impacted the way, for example, extension does things. Normally, we bring in the packages from research, so we extend to the farmers. But in this approach, we are looking at the local context. And to me, it's a success because we have, okay, in the last 2, 3 years, I found that the adoption rate of these local strategies and the scaling from one farmer to another through the running process of farmer to farmer, field days, farmer to farmer networks, it has worked. There is also cooperate with the other stakeholders who come on board, like the input suppliers and the marketers who come, so that we working together towards changing the scenario of now, the impacts of climate change in the dairy value chain. That is, I think we are looking as to the social part of and the behavior part of the farmers and not so much of the technical because we have brought technologies
Sorry,
and
sorry,
most of the
Esther.
time they are not adopted. The back is because thank you.
Esther, we're having some
Yes,
connectivity
and
issues.
that is my take on the positive deviance approach.
Great, thank you, Esther. Just to let you know, we're having
Hello.
some connection issues. Maybe if you can find somewhere where the network is stronger, that would be super helpful. Um, oh, okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Um, so I think what you said is key about kind of fostering that local knowledge and knowledge sharing amongst local stakeholders as well. So that brings me then to my next question, which is for Alvaro. On capacity needs for locally led adaptation, from your experience, kind of what are the most significant knowledge gaps or resource needs that limit effective locally led adaptation?
Thank you so much. Taking the headphones out. Yeah, thank you so much also, Esther, for your very important experience and sharing with us that knowledge. I'm sorry the connection was not too good, so we missed a bit of it. But taking into account base cases and how this information can be spread within communities is a very important part of what locally led adaptation can foster. Very much in line with what Todd was presenting at the beginning in the United Nations University. I'm part of the climate risk analytics team. We work on science-based decision making, supporting stakeholders at different governance levels with their strategies, implementation, monitoring, and others. I think from our perspective, something that it's still it's very much in line with these 8 principles that were presented at the beginning. Something that is key first is communicating science. I think there are still a lot of misinformation out there of what is the certainties and uncertainties that we have in climate science, and that therefore how decision making should be done under this context. There's a lot of misinformation out there about what is can be attributable to climate change and what cannot be. And that can be a bit of a conflict, especially when there are socioeconomic variables that should be addressed in parallel or even first in order to achieve resilience. So that is a very strong challenge, let's say, that we face. Another one is related to climate projections. In our experience, local communities are very familiar with the weather patterns and the changes that are already taking place. However, future scenarios is something that is very hard to integrate into their planning. Um, Again, there's uncertainties related to future scenarios, but there is other information that can be considered already. And lastly, also presented there in the 8 principles is access to means of implementation, including finance, but also open source tools out there that could be used and accessed by them, and that can be updated and adjusted based on the information and their knowledge. In particular, we work with something called the Economics of Climate Adaptation Framework, which is it's underpinned by an open source tool called Climata that uses probabilistic modeling. But then this is heavily informed through stakeholder engagement mechanisms. So having access to those tools from different scales, so some of them are really hard to implement at a local level where data is scarce, but having their input continuously and continuous feedback there, it's a big opportunity to incorporate their needs, their concerns, and their priorities. And in the middle to long term, building capacities for them to use them. So I would say those 3 things. First, the communication of the appropriate science. Second, how to incorporate the uncertainties, but also the knowledge we have about future scenarios. And lastly, access to technology, open source tools, but of course, very importantly, finance.
Thank you, Alvaro. Those are some key points and kind of speak to really being able to empower local communities to deal with the sort of impacts of the climate crisis and empowering them with that data to sort of create informed decisions around locally led adaptation. I will now address my next question for France. So, what are some of the key co-benefits locally led adaptation approaches can have for conflict prevention and sustaining peace?
Yes, hi everyone. So I'm approaching this topic from a slightly different perspective. I'm part of the Focus Climate Security team within the Alliance of Biodiversity and CGIAR, and I lead our policy and governance work stream within this team. I'm not a climate scientist. My background is in peace and conflict, so initial instincts might be, why is this guy even talking about this topic? But for the last year or so, we've been working on the topic of LLA in order to really understand how many of the principles that Todd presented and that are really, or should be embedded within LLA approaches, may also be able to aid us in doing climate action in a conflict-sensitive way. For those of you who maybe not familiar, just a very brief introduction to what conflict sensitivity is. We should really be considering it as a spectrum. So on the one hand, we want to avoid doing harm by basically understanding the context, understanding how our intervention is going to interact with that context, and of course adjust then to prevent unintended negative impacts. But the other side of the spectrum is that we want to maximize capacities to actually do good, right? We want to be able to build capacities for local conflict prevention, create opportunities for peace building both within and between communities, and basically actively contribute to sustaining peace. So the logic is essentially adaptation efforts can strengthen communities' resilience, not only to climate stresses, but also then to other shocks, whether they might be economic in nature or social in nature, and address the drivers of conflict. So for the past year or so, we've been working to develop essentially an institutional analysis framework called the Climate Security Governance Analysis, or the CSGA. It's not a particularly snappy name so far. We're working on rebranding it. But this framework allows us to essentially assess multi-level adaptation instruments and instruments that embody LLA principles to identify both the ways that they are conflict sensitive, but also the ways in which they are not, and basically where additional new capacities might be needed to enable them to be conflict sensitive. And so I'm going to be referring to this framework a little bit to answer that question around why or how conflict sensitivity or sustaining peace can be embedded into LLA. And this rests upon the notion that conflict sensitivity is more than just a tick box exercise where we do A, and that means we've accounted for a particular risk related to conflict. Instead, being conflict sensitive in the context of LLA means actually developing the appropriate mix of institutional capacities, institutional arrangements, and ways of working, and key partnerships, key mandates that firstly allow communities, allows conflict to emerge organically as a topic of concern from affected communities themselves. Secondly, also create tools, ways of working, and involve key actors working on peace and conflict to actually detect and respond to conflict as and when it may emerge in the context of adaptation. And three, when conflict or drivers of conflict do emerge as a topic of concern from communities themselves, during, for example, some of the diagnostic exercise we've heard previously, that capacities exist to actually embed conflict prevention and resolution and peace building into those LLA instruments and programs. So building on this, the framework we developed has three key dimensions, which I'll briefly just indicate as a way to show this is the way that co-benefits for sustaining peace can be achieved. So the first of these, and they overlap significantly with the LLA principles that Todd already introduced. So the first of these is polycentrism, or multi-level governance, capturing how decision-making power is consciously disaggregated across a system. Why is this important for conflict sensitivity? Well, traditionally, policy making has been, or has tended to have this bias towards identifying a problem and solving that problem through quite a usually top-down set of responses, based on a linear theory of change, for example. But we're dealing with very complex socio-ecological systems, obviously, and it's hard to predict how change will actually occur in various parts of the system, and this means that top-down approaches run the risk of developing solutions that are very inappropriate for those local contexts. And if a solution is potentially inappropriate, it may also run the risk of increasing inequalities, increasing tensions between groups, and exacerbating conflict drivers, essentially. So by fostering these local self-organizational capacities where it comes to identifying climate risk, where it comes to identifying solutions for those risks, and leaving institutional legacies, as we heard before. We're basically focusing on generating the appropriate combination of both top-down and bottom-up organizational modalities to ensure that adaptation solutions are not only appropriate to local ecological settings, but also appropriate to local conflict systems and social systems. A second critical requirement for conflict sensitivity that we have in our framework, it relates to adaptive governance, or adaptivity, basically. A key challenge for the effective integration of conflict sensitivity is essentially knowing how interventions into socio-ecological systems may play out, what effects it may have, both in an ecological sense, but also in the social sense. So how interventions may impact relationships between groups, degrees of inequality within and between communities, and the way that natural resource management regimes between different groups actually function. So the principle of adaptivity obviously highlights that policy and programs should not be crafted for a single optimal future or a single optimal scenario. They should be responsive to changes in the context. And so the imperative to create these kind of systems of ongoing monitoring and learning in relation to ecological dynamics also equally applies to social systems. We need to develop the appropriate tools, monitoring frameworks, and response capacities to detect changes in social systems, negative changes in social systems as well, and be able to adjust our programs in response to this as well. And then finally, because I know I've been talking a very long time now, just like LLA highlights the need to address structural inequalities within and between communities, our framework focuses on the need to embed political ecological perspectives into planning, implementation, and evaluation phases of LLA. Climate change is not merely an external force acting upon communities. The way in which it's experienced, the way in which risk and response capacity is distributed is very much based in kind of local political economic landscapes. And the same also goes for climate action itself. Adaptation interventions may reinforce prevailing power relations, create new forms of marginalization, or trigger new forms of violence and opposition. So explicitly examining how climate interventions intersect with these existing dynamics of resource control, and how this may lead to unintended outcomes, the do no harm side of the spectrum, and also design interventions that actually address the root causes of exclusion, vulnerability, and the root causes of conflict as well, is particularly critical. And just very briefly, last point, it's important to remember that in this context, even the act of identifying the problem itself is very political, because working in any kind of adaptation setting, there's different kinds of actors who are able to bring to bear different kinds of power. And so this is something we were talking about just before the event. It's very important to ensure that every aspect of vulnerable communities, like every segment of a community, has a seat at the table when it comes to these diagnostic exercises, to ensure that even some of the more hard to talk about structural drivers of conflict, such as land tenure or things that really affect local power bases, are also able to be brought to the table and identified as part of these participatory diagnostic exercises. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Franz. Made a very good point around kind of, how top-down approaches can exacerbate inequalities. And I think locally led adaptation is sort of central to reducing some of those inequalities that exist between vulnerable groups. Also, we know that, conflict, the climate crisis, and poverty are largely intertwined. So I think now more than ever, it's really important to apply those conflict-sensitive approaches that you outlined for us. So with that, I think we can move on to our second round of questions for the panelists. And now we really want to look at sort of the future opportunities and the scaling of locally led adaptation. So Esther, I will come back to you online. My question for you is, what do you see as sort of the next steps in your locally led adaptation experience to make it more fully and sustainably embedded in local institutional processes? And sort of what opportunities do you see to scale out your approach to locally led adaptation?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the raw network, but I think the way forward from where I stand is that we need to empower the local stakeholders and the local, especially where I come from, the farmer-led community institutions, because these actors know how to address their problems even at a lower cost and at a greater speed. So it's very important we empower them through capacity building, linkages, networks, and partnerships to also do resource mobilization so that they can lead these local-led adaptation initiatives. Two, I think developing power and also financial support to subnational levels can go a long way to support these local-led adaptation practices. For example, if we could access funds at our local level so that we support those farmers and the local actors, I think adaptation can be achieved earlier and at a minimal cost. Another opportunity I'm looking at is that this approach, the positive deviant approach, is applicable to most all the sectors, especially in agriculture, environment, forestry, and even health, because since I've worked with the dairy farmers, I've gone ahead and used the same approach to work with the coffee, avocado, and chicken farmers using the pioneer farmers approach, and also using their local knowledge networks. Because in scaling from one farm to another through their knowledge networks, these strategies, which are practically working towards the achievement of, in fact, doing what leading to adapting the communities to be resilient and also, in fact, the effect of climate change towards their approach, if used, because level and at the actual level, it can empower and we can achieve more through minimal spending. And in doing this, we need to convince the policymakers because they are the ones who really put these things into their development strategies, and also they are the ones who apportion funds for this. If we can really have a lot of evidence we can use the evidence-based campaigns to really convince the leaders so that they can support these local-led initiatives towards climate change. Thank you.
Esther, and indeed, it's key to really kind of get government and policymakers on side to support locally led adaptation and sort of build those frameworks into their policies. So Alvaro, reverting back to you with an additional question. So on technological innovations and locally led adaptation, what role do you see for emerging technologies in strengthening locally led adaptation, and how can these be integrated without compromising sort of local knowledge and autonomy?
Thank you so much. So a couple of things I think from my side. So in terms of emerging or evolving technologies, there's lately, for example, a huge hype regarding AI, right? Artificial intelligence, everybody's talking about it. There are several opportunities coming from them. We also see a lot of improvement in quality and accessibility of satellite imagery, for example. That is also something that is quickly evolving and changing. This brings a lot of opportunities, but also has a series of limitations. And there is where we need to find a balance between traditional and indigenous knowledge and local practices and what these new technologies empower or enable doing. In the case, for example, of artificial intelligence, two maybe quick examples. One of them is how it can improve monitoring, but also projections in terms of climate. So for example, in the context of early warning systems, we're seeing artificial intelligence providing us with much more accurate and much more timely information on coming floods, potentially drought, heat waves, and others. This could enable sort of measures for responding, for quick response and actions. One of them can come, Esther was bringing up the need for funding at a local level. So for example, insurance products such as parametric insurance, for example, which are products maybe for those who are not too familiar that are triggered by a specific parameter, just a specific threshold, and that quickly releases funding. So there is no need for sending somebody to check what the damages are on others. And this can be distributed in a way that is effectively and can allow many communities, local communities, for example, to react. I am also part of a Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, which is hosted at UNU as well. And they have several pilots of projects, in particular in the Pacific Islands, where we're already seeing many of these products, which are often supported by emerging technologies, providing a difference for those communities at a local level. Another example in which we are working on or we're collaborating is using AI for these language models. For example, there is this tool called Chat Climate in which results from the IPCC are translated into more easily accessible knowledge, and communities or anybody can just really get in and chat and ask about specific information and have improved access to it. So there's a lot of opportunities that these emerging technologies bring, both on the side of understanding the risk, but also communicating it to communities and third parties, policymakers, for example, as well, that often are not very familiar with all of the every single part of the science. I want to also maybe highlight a little bit of the effort that France is bringing us. It's maybe from the technological side, but it's social sciences and the evolution that they're getting in the understanding of the complexities and the interconnection of risk. At UNU, we also work in the topic of interconnection. We have an annual report, and we just underscore how addressing just part of the issue would really not bring the effective solutions needed. So I think understanding the nexus that are between these several of the efforts that we're doing here is extremely important. Maybe not to just have too long of an intervention, there are certain limitations that we also need to acknowledge. Emerging technologies in particular, for example, when we talk about artificial intelligence, they have biases. They rely on large amount of data, and in data scarce areas, this is hard to rely on them. Conflict areas, for example, tend to be places, regions in the world where collecting data specifically from diverse and vulnerable groups is quite challenging. We also see that in informal settlements, for example, we have a much higher representation of those living in formality than those living in informality. But we have that in several contexts as well. We can talk about indigenous groups. There are several. So those things also limit how AI can be supportive to some of these groups. There are technological solutions that can be used, but a lot of it will be really, again, to the point that Esther was bringing, linked to policy in which this data, it's also collected to reflect the needs of different groups. Yeah, I think finally the last point I would like to make is regarding this balance that needs to be done between traditional knowledge and, let's say, more Western science, if we can call it like that. We've had encounter experiences in which local practitioners have a very different perception of what caused climate. So it can be due to a deity or the religious belief system. It can be a punishment for a certain situation or others. So how to balance this traditional knowledge with our scientific understanding? We need platforms in which these discussions can happen openly, not in the sense that we're going to teach you better or this is actually what is happening, but providing information to let them know, in addition to your understanding, there is also this information that could help you address this in the future. So yeah, several points there about limitation, how to find some sort of balance or interaction between traditional science and other source of sciences, and yeah, and the opportunities that these emerging technologies are actually bringing, and some of them we're seeing now and are improving, or we're seeing them improve very quickly. Thanks.
Thank you, Alvaro. Yeah, you make some very good points around kind of reporting and existing gaps in data, which I think is kind of a challenge across the board that, collaborators are looking to address. And I'm not sure there's still yet one sort of solid solution to, but it's great that there are sort of technological innovations that are emerging, especially when it comes to climate predictability and the difficulty in that area. And as you mentioned as well, with local communities, it's not about kind of dictating sort of what the data is saying, but empowering them with it, and also kind of opening the floor to discussion and integrating their own knowledge into that as well. Franz, the next question I have is for you. So what additional institutional arrangements, practices, and capacities do locally led adaptation instruments and approaches need to truly mainstream conflict sensitivity?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so to answer this question, I'm going to go for the shameless second plug of our framework. But I also think it's more useful to talk about an instance where this has actually been deployed already, just to give some actual insights from the ground, basically. And so we used our framework for the very first time this year. We spent 3 weeks in Kenya looking at the County Climate Change Fund mechanism. Some of you may be aware of it already. Just to briefly set the scene for this particular instrument. It focuses on unlocking local climate finance in particular. So it's embedded in legislation developed at the county level in Kenya. The fund exists at the county level in Kenya. And just tying into some of the previous speakers where they were saying about the importance of having policymakers, higher level strategic buy-in for some of these ideas. This is a very good example of this because it features, it's like a key feature, it's embedded within Kenya's national climate change strategy. And because it's part of Kenya's devolution process, it's very much embedded structurally within the legislative environment in Kenya, which I think is very important for buy-in. And scaling of this instrument is also being supported by a World Bank program called FLOCA. So anyway, there's a lot of movement around this in particular. And the way this works is there's a number of multi-stakeholder platforms developed at county level and at ward level within Kenya. And it's supported by our partner that we've been working with, which is called the Adaptation Consortium or ADA Consortium, who a parastatal body. They kind of support, provide the tools and some of the information and do some of the capacity building for all the key actors involved in this. And essentially the way the process works is that there is a participatory diagnostic exercise done with communities and conducted by ward level platforms with communities. Those ward level platforms then on the basis of the risks identified develop specific investment proposals that are submitted to the county level, and the county level then on the basis of a number of different criteria go back and forth with the ward to identify basically identify and put together an investment plan and work together to deliver specific technical support where needed in terms of site selection, these kind of things. And eventually then the money comes from the county fund and the investment is hopefully implemented. So yeah, we've been working with the ADA Consortium specifically to look at this instrument and identify potential sources of conflict sensitivity and potential gaps. I'm not going to go into super amounts of detail about this work because the full report will be publicly available online later this year. So if you are interested, hit me up after the event and be sure to, I can connect. But yeah, I just want to highlight a few kind of key points from this research just to illustrate a few practical gaps and practical things that are going very well for the integration of conflict sensitivity and peace positivity as well. So firstly, peace and conflict actors are not currently structurally embedded within the CCCF, that's the acronym, institutional architecture. So as I said, it consists of a variety of multi-sectoral platforms, and particularly at county level, these consist of different directorates. So we're talking about climate change directorates, obviously, disaster risk reduction actors, water management actors, these kind of things. But peace and conflict actors, although they do exist within Kenya, are not part of these platforms. And this means that in the process of the investment proposal writing and the back and forth that goes between the ward and the county, their expertise is not effectively being utilized to assess the way in which these particular investment proposals are going to have, the impacts they're going to have on local socio-economic, socio-political, socio-cultural effects and how that may tie into conflict risk. So the very first thing I think in terms of scaling is to actually develop legislation that would embed these key actors into the institutional architecture of LLA programs instruments. However, the corresponding opportunity in this regard, and I think this ties into a lot about what Alvaro was saying about embedding and finding ways to actually engage with and put front and center traditional knowledge. We also found that at ward level, at an informal level, even though particular formal rules were not developed for this, the ward platforms are already engaging with local peace and conflict actors, traditional peace and conflict actors. So these might be rangeland management committees or councils of elders, these kind of things, who have a traditional peace and conflict resolution mandate. So this stuff is already happening. It's just building on what's already happening and then finding ways to embed formally what's already happening informally. Secondly, also related to what you were saying, Alvaro, data collection and monitoring capacities that are currently in the CCCF that might relate to collecting data around climate change risk, particular natural risks that are associated with natural resources. This data is not being used to capture conflict risk, and it could be, essentially. The same architecture could be used for this. So the CCCF has developed, as I said, a lot of methodologies, participatory methodologies to engage in climate risk assessments, and these generate a lot of information with regards to local perceptions of risks, local perceptions of solutions, and socio-ecological dynamics. And this information is being effectively collated at county level to map out essentially what climate change risks different communities within the county face. But conflict also features in these participatory risk assessments. It's not excluded from them, but information on conflict is not being effectively recorded or stored or mapped at all, and it could be. And this would be a very important source of information, particularly given how, as you were saying, in conflict areas, we're often missing this kind of critical information. Let's use some of these participatory risk assessment processes and these diagnostic processes that are happening to actually capture this information and then make sure that we're actually getting that information to the right actors, because this could be used for, I'm a researcher, so from a research perspective it would be very interesting, but also operationally in terms of developing early warning systems for conflict and developing concrete response capacities to respond to conflict when it arises. Thirdly, I have 4 points, so 2 more to get through. Where evidence of conflict sensitivity is apparent within the design and implementation of specific investments, it's usually limited to avoiding conflict risk rather than actually seeking to resolve conflict or actually to engage in peace building. So as I mentioned previously, these kind of local peace and conflict actors that are informally part of the process, their main role is to identify, hey, this investment that you're considering doing might anger this particular community, or it's being done. Usually what we found is that it's being done in an area that is already subject to contestation. So don't do it there. But their involvement is limited to that. They're kind of consulted as part of that process, but they're not then further engaged or capacitated to actually say, hey, let's do some conflict mapping. Let's understand why this conflict system exists. And so there's a much better need to actually capacitate these local groups, but also capacitate the instrument as a whole to engage in actual conflict analysis, understand what conflict drivers are, both proximate and structural, and try and embed efforts to actually address these conflict drivers within these specific investment proposals. And crucially also developing as part of that, when needed, a transboundary approach, because this is a key thing which I think LLA is also struggling with a little bit, is that we're also often stuck to or forced to implement LLA within existing administrative boundaries, which doesn't lend itself well to shared resources all the time. So this is a bit of an issue. And then finally, short one, monitoring and evaluation activities that are related to the implementation of LLA or specific investments under it. We found that they're usually based on quite technical indicator sets. So although structural inequalities are being addressed in some cases, even this is limited to, for example, an indicator that is number of people who have access to water now, which is obviously good and important to monitor. But actual monitoring of impacts on social systems, on intercommunal relations is not being monitored. Neither is impacts on peace, for example. And again, this represents a missed opportunity to actually collect data as well, because we need to understand as researchers, but as implementers as well, what is working and why did it work, essentially. So there's a lot of opportunity to utilize LLA instruments and the diagnostic exercises they do, the kind of monitoring, all the data they generate essentially across all the phases of the program cycle to inform conflict sensitive approaches in the future as well. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Franz. And yeah, you make a very good point around kind of building in conflict analysis into sort of already existing analysis and data collection and reporting that's being carried out. So with that, I kind of want to sort of look to the audience and really open up the panel to questions from all of you. So if you have a specific question, please raise your hand and please let me know to which panelist you'd like to address your question to. Yes, let me hand you the mic.
Good morning. My name is Ferdinand Gierke. I work for Bread for the World. We're a German NGO working in more than 80 countries on a lot of LLA work. So coming from more of the practical perspective, so the two of us are facilitating LLA kind of training of trainers. We have a tool. It's called participatory assessment of climate disaster risk that we are trialing in different communities. We're based in the Middle East, and coming from this practical approach, I can relate to a lot of the scientific things, but I just wanted to share that that sounds like an incredible task to be done. It needs a lot of time and investment, especially the colleague talking about conflict sensitivity. I would wish for more of that planning, but this sounds like a 5-year, 10-year project to be had. Oftentimes, unfortunately, we don't have this time. In terms of specific questions, I wanted to ask to Esther. She mentioned, if I got her correctly, something that's called a post deviance approach or so. I maybe didn't get it quite right. If she could just elaborate of what this post deviance approach, or what was it called, entails. And if I could already pose a second question then. To you, Franz. So we're working in the Middle East, which is a very conflict-ridden region. However, most of the trials of conflict-sensitive adaptation planning are done in other regions of the world where there's maybe the conflict is not as acute or widespread. What do you think is needed for also research and implementation to be brought to a country like Iraq or Syria, where there's a lot of conflict and need for adaptation? What are maybe the main challenges, or how would you, what's your take on that? Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe I'll start with Esther on the question around post-deviance approaches. Esther?
Yes, thank you for the question. So, positive deviant approach is we are looking at in our daily farming systems is that normally there is a problem of climate change affecting the way farmers produce. So we go to these communities and look at, amidst all this climate change effects, there are farmers who are doing better than the rest because they are adopting some management practices or technologies. So they are deviating from the norm. Normally, the others are suffering, their daily systems are really suffering from the vagaries of climate change. But amidst that, these farmers are, the positive deviants are in fact adapting to climate change in their daily farming practices. practices. Then now we ask, then now that we get the positive deviance, is that they are implementing some strategies in their management, which others are not doing. And that is from this positive deviance approach in the climate and livestock initiative. That is what we call a pioneer deviation. So this farmer is deviating from the norms of the rest of the farmers in that local environmental context. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Franz, I will now hand over to you for the second question around research and contextually specific for the Middle East.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So I'm also based in the Middle East and work primarily on the Middle East, so I share your pain on this topic. I want to say two key things. So one is to effectively not just talking about conflict sensitivity, but to scale LLA in general, you need to have embedded within a more developed institutional framework, essentially, a more sophisticated policy environment, and conflict destroys that. So, you know, paradoxically, the areas that need it most are the areas where it often doesn't get trialed because, you know, it gets stuck at pilot phases and it's done here and there, but it's never embedded within an actual policy system. So that's the short answer. I think in terms of the research response, this research need that relates to that is we do still need to try and implement LLA in these areas, and particularly generate research around conflict sensitivity in these areas. I think that the study that we did in Kenya, which, as you said, is an example from outside the region, but we really hope to scale this approach elsewhere, and we are exploring to do this in the region as well, is as far as we were aware, like the first attempt to actually do this, to try and map capacities within LLA for conflict. So it's a starting point, but I completely agree with you, it's a very challenging context. And the second point specific to the MENA region as well is that the principles that LLA embody and represent are not an easy pill to swallow for a lot of governments in the region, because you've got a lot of heavily centralized governments, and okay, yeah, developing decentralized or devolved approaches is institutionally challenging. So yeah, that is of course a factor. But politically speaking, yeah, talking about empowering governorate level administrations is, you know, not a popular topic of conversation. I think we're just far enough out in the Middle East now that I can maybe share a couple of things from Egypt where I'm based. So I mean, and this is not just to LLA, this is about scaling any program in general. Egypt is a very centralized government, to put it mildly, and any attempt essentially to go and scale anything beyond really local level, village level, sometimes slightly higher, is incredibly challenging because there's a certain amount of socioeconomic or critical mass you can reach, and then it becomes, or is perceived to become, a threat to, you know, the central authority. So yeah, doing LLA in these kind of contexts is very challenging. I think we have to be quite picky and maybe choose what is feasible where, and at least try and build an evidence base around that with regards to what works. So yeah, that's my answer. Sorry if it's a bit pessimistic and depressing, but yeah.
Thank you, Franz. We have another question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Mercy, and I'm a graduate student with Cornell University, and I also work on local Led Adaptation with the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizen. Sorry. My question is to both of you, and you spoke about like emerging technologies like AI, and there are new research about like AI's use on natural resources, and I worked on a project where like AI in upstate New York was dependent on water use. Sorry, on water use, and I see this as like a channel of conflict. So what do you think is like the impact of AI's use on natural resources? Like what is the impact on local-led adaptation? And to you, like how can we solve like this, the use of AI like and climate risks with local communities?
Thank you for your question. So the first one is for you, Alvaro, on AI.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I'm actually not the ultimate AI expert. We do work with it and on our team, and we're looking into opportunities to work with it better. I think in terms of natural resources, the consumption of natural resources or the burden that it may have, it's something that is being studied at the moment. I think there's always a trade-off in how to do this in a way that is more sustainable. I think from our perspective is a technology that it looks like its growth would be unavoidable. It's coming in many industries, in many sectors and others. So our approach is a bit to look into the opportunities this brings as well. But definitely standards and practices that are discussed in a way so that this is done in the most sustainable way. They are extremely important, and I would agree with you. There are uses as well that our different teams within UNU and others are looking into that could provide protection and also opportunities to monitor natural resources, ecosystem services, and others, for example. So that could be a way in which we can inform how this is evolving and where this is going. But definitely it's a challenge. It's something to take into account. The role of governance in this is essential. We just cannot let this go freely and everybody just on their own. So having that perception on, okay, this is where this energy can come from, for example, or how this can be done, it's extremely important as well. So I hope that helps with the question.
Great, yeah, and the question was AI in conflict sensitivity as well, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm also going to have to be honest and say that I'm definitely not the authority on AI. But I don't have that much to say about it because I really don't know much about the topic. But just to say that in terms of its predictive utility, for example, in conflict, I'd steer away from that because predicting conflict is notoriously very difficult, if not impossible. But maybe perhaps in terms of some data monitoring and data management, particularly when it comes to actually mapping the interactions of different kinds of risks that usually interact with each other in very non-linear ways, so social risks and ecological risks together. I can maybe see the space for it in there, but this is coming at it from a very non-expert view. So yeah, sorry if that doesn't answer your question fully.
Thank you both. We have another question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Lisa, and I'm with One Acre Fund, which is a social enterprise that works with 4.8 million farmers in East Africa. And my question was to Alvaro and even Esther, if she can be able to answer it. You mentioned scientific knowledge being disseminated, and I was wondering, what have you found to be the best way to disseminate this information to local communities, especially breaking it down and simplifying it so that communities like farmers can be able to understand this and make use of it? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Esther, I'll hand over to you. So the question on information and getting it through at the community level.
Yes. Yes, from I'm an extensionist, and our work as extension officers, we extend these technologies and management practices to the farmers. But from the experience of this project, which uses positive deviant approach, I've come to realize that most of the time we assume that the knowledge which is with the farmers don't add up. But from this experience, I come to realize that finding the local knowledge is very important. Then, as you bring in the new technologies and from research, it's better you start from the known, what farmers are doing, because they are already in that context and they are adapting to climate change in their own ways. So what happens is that for example, I'm borrowing heavily from this approach on what I do because I found out that co-planning and co-designing and even co-implementation with the farmers is more of, yeah, they adopt more from that than me bringing all these technologies from research and then as a package, I bring them to the farmers. For example, I've been working with farmers for 15 years, but most of the time we bring in technologies which less than 10% of the farmers are simply because maybe we are talking of what we know or what we think should be done, but farmers all the time, and even in our communities, community knows their challenges and the problems, and sometimes they know the solutions. They only need support so that they can address these challenges. So from where I stand, using the local citizens to participate in how we support them to adapt to climate change in building in then this program should be very flexible in that we are all of us are actors. In fact, we should really put a way to address the power imbalances between the stakeholders and then the users who are the farmers. That is from my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Over to you, Alvaro.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question. So, from our experience, we have tried different approaches to work with communities and other stakeholders. I think something that has come across, and I think Esther made a very strong point in that one, is that many of these efforts needs to be cross-cutting. So, even when you're talking with local communities, you shouldn't do it, in my opinion and in our experience, as an isolated exercise. So, we try to bring different stakeholders to the table. I would be very interested in listening to the experience of the colleagues here in from Broadfoot Belt, to just see how they're also engaging with this type of um, training of trainers, to see how to engage them in different ways. Something that we actually found quite interesting was we have a board game that we developed for insurance products with GIZ. And it's a board game that is called Hotel Resilience. They're also actually going to play it here in the Capacity Building Hub in the coming days. So I would definitely welcome you to try it. And then you just sit with them and you give them some assets, and then playing with dice, you get a certain event coming and affecting your assets. And you need to use different adaptation measures, one of which is insurance. And it gives you a very good understanding on how insurance is not there to cover everything, just certain category of events and others. And it's a very useful exercise in that it also allows them to speak freely about their knowledge and their experience in about these things, right? Because often we see in these, I don't know, in a webinar setup or others, you just hear one side speaking, or maybe not them speaking to each other, even they're sitting in the same room. So this type of situation, tell them, no, well, really, this is not how we experience it. When we have this and that asset, it just doesn't work that way. And other places, it's like, okay, this could work for us, or I would like to know more about this solution, or how could this look in a different way. So we have different ways to communicate. One of them is definitely capacity strengthening. The UNU has a master programs that work with very international students from different contexts. So that is one way to do so. We also have MOOCs as well on disaster risk finance and insurance. For example, we have one MCII opened last year. We have these board games as part of several of our workshops and other activities that we do. And I think, and that might sound a bit, like I guess in line with the question here, is this a short-term or a long-term effort? But it definitely should be an exchange, a conversation. I do think climate change, unfortunately, it's a long-term issue that we need to address step by step. But a way we've found to make it more meaningful and impactful is definitely engage people since very early on, and try to find the right way to communicate with them. I think if you have done, I can imagine in your experience, you've also seen that how in some of these meetings, for example, talking with men is easier than talking with women, or with certain communities easier than the other. So how to balance those things is always challenging, but you need a mixed approach to bring people with different levels of knowledge, different expertise, that are willing to involve there. I wanted just to make a comment about France, what he said. We just finished a project in Egypt as well. We worked with the Financial Regulatory Authority, which is not, their job is really not climate. we find there in Egypt an open-mindedness to this type of situations, but actually their engagement, we worked with them over a year and a half, only came a workshop we had 2 weeks ago in which they actually saw the results and understood in their terms what that meant. And the thing is that many of them have a family member that lives in a community or that lives outside of the city, or that have experienced this in a different way, or have linked conflict, for example. So there are, my just comment on this is there are different ways in which being with a certain group of decision makers can actually translate into getting information and getting things somewhere else. But it's a process that requires patience. It's a process that requires coming to events like this and talking to others. So yeah, I just was trying to address those two things. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvaro. France has an intervention.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly on communication, just from a conflict sensitivity perspective, the mode of communication, the type of communication used is very important. I just also want to very briefly stress the importance of communication and consistent communication, the role that plays in trust. This is also something that we heard in Kenya quite a lot, in that sometimes information was only provided at very particular moments of implementation or design, and then it's kind of like parachuting in, parachuting out, and people hadn't engaged with the mechanism since the very first participatory analysis they'd done, and this lack of continuous communication with the communities actually was kind of damaging to institutional trust in this context. It was having the opposite effect that you would expect it to see. So just to briefly highlight that as well.
Thank you, Franz, and to Esther and Alvaro. I think there's some really key points there on having kind of a balanced approach with the communities and kind of that capacity enhancing that we sort of seek to do, and that element of trust, which is kind of key to establishing and building a long-term relationships with these communities, and again harnessing that local knowledge and sharing as well what information is out there. Do we have any more questions or interventions from audience members? Sure.
Just one quick comment. What I really liked and I wanted to underline is this a parallelity of knowledges that you mentioned, Alvaro, earlier. It got me thinking, indigenous knowledge systems that have a more maybe transformational potential to transform societies in the way that the Western-driven climate debate has not been able to do yet. I think that's very important, and it's always a trial and error. For example, in our tool, we have redesigned it now for 10 years to be very easy to use and having different knowledge cultures at the same time. But also, coming back to your question, I think it needs a lot of listening and trial and error in order to arrive at something that's really worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think that sort of brings us to, that's a great point. That brings us to the end of our sort of question sessions with the panelists. So before I kind of wrap up on some final remarks, I would just like to say a big thank you to Esther, Franz, and Alvaro for answering those questions. So maybe kind of one sort of key takeaway or statement from each of you on a sort of call to action or key point that you'd like our audience members to take away from today's event. So Esther, maybe I'll start with you, if that's okay. Esther, I think you're on mute. Can you hear us?
Yes, I think I've enjoyed the discussion. And what I can get is that in this local led adaptation towards climate change, I think we need more of a participatory processes so that we look at ways we should be promoting ways whereby the users are at the center of the designing and the implementation of these interventions if we have to succeed. And most of the time, you would find that projects have been designed from the top, then they really don't even contextualize because climate change is locally, it is context based. What works in some other place might not work where I'm working. So, but we are spending a lot of money implementing climate change action projects which are not bringing change to the communities which are supposed to be beneficiaries since because we are looking at that somebody somewhere might be designing something which will work somewhere and they don't have the basics. So I think we are losing a lot of money in implementing projects which don't bring out results in this adaptation towards climate change. Thank you for hosting me.
Thank you so much, Esther. Alvaro.
Thank you so much. Yeah, from my side as well. Thank to all of the panelists and everyone for organizing, Vanessa for moderating this as well. I guess the message is that locally led adaptation was the past, is the present, and will be the future of adaptation. So the climate risks and others have been faced by communities locally always, and the ones that are leading a lot of these efforts are definitely local leaders, local people. So it's just unavoidable. I think what it's remarkable is how now this is rising to the top of many conversations, also in the context of loss and damage. I think the point of a stair of having a people-centered approach to it is essential. It's just not having a prescriptive approach to any of these things, how to channel finance and then through innovative solutions, including insurance and many others, how to leverage technologies that are coming and others, and how to innovate as well in ways to engage with these communities. I think there are challenges there. There are challenges, in my opinion, understanding both traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge. I feel that there is a lot of romanticization, I don't know if that's a word, of the of local knowledge very often, that sometimes it needs to be addressed as well, as sometimes there are mistakes there, sometimes there are things that could be better on others. So it's there to stay. It is a very powerful tool. It's a very important tool. And just saying that this is a process, it might not be extremely quick, but I think right now it has the attention that it deserves, and I think hopefully in the middle to long term it's gonna be scaled up appropriately.
Thank you, Alvaro. Over to you, Franz.
Yeah, two very brief messages. Don't forget about the peace and conflict lens when we're talking about LLA. It might not necessarily be the very first thing you think about. It probably shouldn't be the very first thing you think about, but LLA by definition has a very strong social justice dimension, and I think we should continue to advocate not just for LLA to keep rising up the agenda, as Alvaro said, but also to ensure conflict sensitive and peace positive approaches within it. And just the second part of that with regards to a need that still remains is particularly with regards to what this actually means, embedding conflict sensitivity into LLA. We need to expand the evidence base still, particularly in examples from different regions, to break through some of the challenges we discussed already. And like I said, I think the approaches that we developed, we hope to scale them in the coming years and start to develop this kind of comparative analysis dimension, or comparative evidence base, basically to understand what works and where and how, and provide this to policy and decision makers, show them what works. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. And again, thank you to all the panelists and also our speaker earlier, Todd Crane. I think we've heard sort of the challenges and gaps that do exist at the moment, but the opportunities that are there for LLA in the future, and it's really sort of central to building resilience and leading on efforts for adaptation and addressing the climate crisis. So once again, thank you to our panelists, thank you to our audience, thank you for your questions and engagement, and that marks the end of our session.